You're familiar by now with my technique of circling back. It's true that we can never approach anything directly in reality. To expect that we can have an alignment and draw a straight line is very convenient if you're deluded about space-time. We know by now that space-time has a curvature in it. And though on very short distances the curvature is almost unnoticeable, beyond being noticeable, the larger that space-time becomes, the more curved it is. We know also that the curvature of space-time is a very peculiar kind of a quantity as well as a peculiar quality. We know that the curvature of space-time can also achieve an unimaginable comprehension, so that the curvature of space-time is zero. So that the bend of a line is so radical that it bends back upon itself not in a circle but in zeroness. Such an occurrence of a zero curvature space-time produces what we call now a black hole. The cover of one of our pairs of texts, we keep using pairs of books. Pairs of books which work together are a complementarity. Pairs of books which work against each other form a polarity. But if we use the term polarity, we run into trouble. So we have to keep our mind on the fact that a pair of books, the other one to the nature of space and time, is Niels Bohr's Times by Abraham Pius. Pius, a Dutch physicist who was around, who knew Einstein and Bohr and many of the others. We're using this pair of books. As long as we have a pair of books like this, we not only have a pair, but we have the possibility of a symmetry. So that in nuclear physics, we read not so much about pairedness, but about symmetry. And we learn that curved space-time, curved space moving in a time fourth dimension, has the capacity in a rare event to have zero curvature, and that singularity that occurs is a black hole, but also that a black hole breaks symmetry, is asymmetrical. So the term for it that Stephen Hawking is popularized, that Roger Penrose, his co-author in this book, made first available, is that a singularity breaks symmetry and is asymmetrical. So that the laws of symmetry, while they apply almost all of the time, everywhere, we know now that there are occasions and places where the application runs out and ceases. Now, in high Dharma meditation, the specialty of the house is to be able to realize that when the extent of existence and its polarity, along with its adjunct quality of identity, in other words, when you have pairedness, you not only have polarity, but you have identity. Identity is a special case of polarity. This is where the polarities are equal. Identity. But we know in high Dharma meditation that there is a reality which exceeds the term event, but nevertheless occurs, where the running out of the application of space-time creates emptiness. So that the singularity of nuclear physics is misnamed because we carry over an association that singularity means oneness. And indeed, the association that's carried over in the mind is that a zero curvature space-time singularity is something, a black hole in this case. Whereas, on the other hand, the application of physiological experience to high Dharma meditation shows again and again in repeatability that you come to zero, not oneness. It's true that at very deep levels one comes to an allness, one comes to an oceanic allness. Absolutely. But that oceanic allness blanks out, or blinks out, perhaps would be a better phrase. Or the best phrase is that its occurrence discontinues. So that at some future time, a recontinuation happens, and one can, through experiment, through repeated scientific yogic experiment, determine that in fact one had an occurrence of emptiness. All of the continuities that one could define, or one could list, or one could hope to even imagine, were taken up again. There was, in fact, no break in the continuity whatsoever, except that repeated experiment shows that there was an occurrence of nothing happening. Now, I told a humorous story that heard in the late 60s in Berkeley, California, the first time that a real Tibetan Rinpoche came to the University of California campus, Chogyam Trungpa, fresh from England. And he came to speak in the basement of a church off Telegraph Avenue. And everyone was waiting. We hadn't heard of Rinpoche before. And in comes the precious one, the meditation master, wearing a plaid shirt outside of his pants, carrying a 2-liter Coke bottle by the neck and a cigarette in the other hand, and looking like a little boy with his hair down in kind of a Three Stooges kind of a haircut, and came sauntering, shuffling out, and just sat on a bar stool. I don't know why the church had a bar stool, but in Berkeley in the 60s, that's what was there. And it looked like brat kid sitting there until he began to speak. And he just spoke clear, nonstop, with the most articulate kind of syntax about high-level meditation, which if you had any experience at all, you knew that he just had mastered it completely. Except that he folded in a wisdom story about himself as an 8-year-old first learning that nothingness happens. That emptiness occurs in, not in fact, but in non-identifiable fact. non-identifiable non-fact. Here's the story that he told in brief. He was put before a root guru, Jamgon Kongtrul of Sechin, who wrote a beautiful little book translated in English called The Torch of Certainty. So he's like apprenticed as an 8-year-old to this powerful meditation master whose lineage went back to a curious kind of a thing where there were reincarnations that split the incarnation in between several people. And then those people's karmas braided together and made a very peculiar complex, so that the reincarnations later on were like braided karma. Not just a single karma, but very, very unusual. And so there he was teaching the 8-year-old, Chogyam Trungpa. And he sat, and as Trungpa said, on the day that he went to see him every day, he would have to go out away from the Chamdo monastery complex where he was in East Tibet and go up on the hillside and go up onto a precipice. And there in this kind of like a meadow niche, maybe one of these glacial meadow niches, there was this clapboard cabin that had no windows, so that when you went in, all you saw was little bits of daylight coming through the slats, and that was it. So he would sit in there with him, with his root guru, and they would just be there. And after the session of saying nothing, nothing happening, he said that his guru asked him, what happened? And he would say to him, nothing happened. And the root guru would say, good, that's good. And he'd say, now don't tell anyone. So he would walk away and walk back down the path, 8 years old, wondering what not to tell. If you have an impure mind, if you have a messed up physiology, if you have a fantasized consciousness, if you sit in a darkened room with just little slats of light coming in with some powerful presence, all kinds of associative phantoms will present themselves. All kinds of speculative physiology occurrences will happen. All kinds of mental stuff occurs. The fact that the 8-year-old was a more than a 10th generation incarnation, very purified by that time. So, of course, nothing happened. He was just there. Completely. So that nothingness happens. But nothingness happens on this kind of very rarefied, purified, perfected quality of attention. Similar thing happens in physics, in science, in mathematics. Here's one of the world's great physicists, John Archibald Wheeler, professor emeritus at Princeton for 50 or 60 years, has been one of the world's great physicists. And here he has, in this collection of essays, At Home in the Universe, Beyond the Black Hole is this essay, and he has something to say about 10 lines on mathematical certainty. And this is what it reads like. Mathematics also is emptiness without emptiness. Excuse me, but that's what it reads. This world-famous professor of physics who's done the great textbook on gravitation and quantum measurement. Mathematics is also emptiness without emptiness. A familiar theorem, this is a theorem is from geometry. Geometry that started with Pythagoras and then after a couple of hundred years was formalized in Alexandria by a man named Euclid. And the sections, the steps of proofs are called theorems. And so a familiar theorem so that it refers to geometry. A familiar theorem tells us that the sum of the three interior angles of a plane triangle is 180 degrees. If you add all three of the angles of a triangle, it'll total 180 degrees. However, this is a famous first word, however, when we review all the definitions that go into making up that theorem, all of the postulates that go to making up that theorem, definitions are boundaries of forms for the mind through language. Postulates are visionary bubbles of possibility in a somewhat modified language. When we review all the definitions and postulates and axioms, axioms are principle rules that are unchanged, that they always apply. If we review, writes Wheeler, all of the definitions, postulates, and axioms that go into providing that theorem, the sum of the three interior angles of the triangle is 180 degrees. If we review all the parts of that theorem, we find, by review, he means look at it really closely, closer than just speaking it by rote, by ritual, but looking at it with refined differential consciousness to see what it is on its nuclear level, we then find that the statement reduces in the end to an identity equivalent to 0 equals 0. That's what it reads. That the so-called practical bottom line of the simplest theorem in geometry reduces to 0 equals 0, that identity. And then he writes an interrogative. No identity? Question mark. Then no theorem. It may take 300 pages of computer paper to spell out all of the foundation pieces of a theorem, customary journal proof of which only requires 2 pages, but packaged as all the parts of the theorem are, and useful as the theorem is, it is still, in the end, packaged identity. Name brand or not. That's all that's in that package. His last sentence, like the structure of rope with a trick knot, it has only to be pulled on to fall apart into nothingness. That's on page 291 in his collected essays, published by the American Institute of Physics Press. So what are we talking about here? We're saying that really refined attention in meditation and in science consistently show that the mind can get down to 0, can get down to emptiness. It goes to a level below the last level. So that when one is talking about singularity, it doesn't mean 1, it means 0. Doesn't mean that space-time has a curvature that reduces to 1, but to 0. So it's a misnomer to say, well, black holes are a singularity. They are a zeroarity, if you can make up that kind of word. And one of the most startling things that Stephen Hawking came up with, in fact, the radiation is called Hawking's radiation, that there's kind of the lightest fog around black holes imaginable due to the evaporation of black holes. That they evaporate, and they leave a very characteristic signature that this lightest of all fogs always has a paired structure. It means, like Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching says, that on the deepest level that you can talk, things are paired. But that the Tao is not anything you can talk about, and it's not paired at all. So when we began this education a couple of years ago, almost, and as we're going to begin in a couple of months for the last time, we have to recognize that straight talk, practical consideration, is that nature is a mystery. Nature is not a comedy, nor is it a tragedy. That very frequently it's comedic or tragic, but that in fact its own nature is mysterious, and that the mysteriousness is like a resonance of the zeroarity that reality has, not in its structure, not in its operation, but in its reality. And that the mind, being real, is capable of coming down to that level of truthfulness. That the mind is able to be zeroarity in itself. And that comes out as emptiness in a kind of meditation, and it comes out as zero in mathematics. Even comes out to 0 equals 0, which gives you a very peculiar quality. We usually use the term transcendence to mean going above, but this is a transcendence that goes underneath. What would we call that? A subscendence. We have to have a new word, to even make up new words. Why do we have to enlarge the vocabulary? Why do we have to have this kind of trick-like grammar, this kind of magical syntax? Because we're using language in new ways. No one ever had to talk this way. What does the guy say in Ghostbusters? He says about the structure of that apartment that Sigourney Weaver's character lives in. He says, Bill Murray says, well, they don't build them like that anymore. And the guy says, no, you idiot, they never built them that way. We need a different language and a different education procedure because we were never real before. We were caricatures. We were projected forms of a fantasization that had become ritualistic, that we not only grew up out of, but we grew under, deep enough to wake up. So that we woke up in two different ways at once. And not everybody's awake yet, but the birds are singing. And the sun is coming up just as sure as day happens. But it's impossible to educate oneself and not include science. Because science has to do with the cosmos in its objectivity. And the cosmos in its objectivity is like the biggest mountain range you can imagine. It's so big that you can't even imagine it. Like a friend of mine said once, he was flying in a little private plane in Bhutan against the Himalayas. She said the plane felt like a little tiny goldfish. And the mountains were so huge. And then to realize that the sky was even huger than that, all of a sudden it brought the physiological sense of proportion home. That beyond this incomprehensible Himalayan range and the most unbelievable sky that was like deep ultraviolet above it because they were so high already, almost to see stars, but that the stars beyond it were infinite. That the sense of proportion became infinitesimal. And that you can enlarge the cosmos in its objectivity to any scale and reduce any objective form to a quantum dot, which is smaller than a microdot. It means all of the known universe that is visible, 15 billion light years worth, is a quantum dot in some vastness of objectivity, so that there's no use in getting huffy. And asserting property rights is no sign of maturity. It just doesn't happen. But that one cannot know that until we get through several phases, at least 4 phases, 4 orders of intelligence beyond where the mind achieves emptiness. That the farthest that classical yoga reached is like the farthest that classical science reached. It reached exactly and only to the halfway point. That there is as much yet to be learned and done as was learned and done to this moment. And that what is sobering is that no matter how sophisticated one becomes, you never exceed that center point, that halfway mark. So that the first ground level rule of spiritual maturity is to realize humility. The great translator of Zen from Japan to the Western world, D.T. Suzuki, his first name, Tai-Setsu, means humility. Mr. Humility was biggest Zen master of 20th century from Japan. And if you look at the array of 30 or 35 works translated into English, because his speciality was to bring the Japanese Zen understanding into the English language arena. That was his specialty. He was born to do that, lived to do that. For 97 years, did that. And at the center of the array of his works is the Zen of no mind. Zero. Zero-arity. And that the polarized identity, confidence, is misplaced in many different ways. It's just simply misplaced. And to assert some kind of superiority on that basis, or to be bombastic vis-a-vis other beings on that basis, is old-fashioned meanness and has no place whatsoever in a conscious future. Now, the difficulty about all of this is that in order to talk in a very normal, everyday language by beginning of 21st century about the objective cosmos, one has to use scientific talk. You can't talk a meditative talk about the cosmos. You can talk high Dharma talk about the end of the mind, but you can't talk high Dharma wisdom language about the cosmos. Why? Because it is realistically not possible. The strongest yogi, the most compassionate, beautiful soul, the most incredibly accomplished master can present refinement of meditation, spirituality to nth degree of perfectibility, has nothing whatsoever to say about the cosmos. If they did, they would have an egotistical thorn in their side that they would have to work on for who knows how many aeons. First thing you learn is that you don't have one thing to say. in terms of the mind's integrative capacity, because it comes to 0 point and vanishes. That entire ecology of very good sense, of very practical reality, concentrates to exactly nothing. Now, if you don't take it that far, you think, well, it concentrates to this God image. Or it translates to this meditative state. Or one has some kind of transcendental, overweening meditative state that's oceanic all. You're still within a microdot of oneness. And subscendence of that puffs it out to vanishing. It simply doesn't occur anymore at all. None of it occurs. There are no resonances at all. There are no vibrations at all. The purest, nicest love vibrations that were always there do not occur. And then after a while they occur again as if nothing happened. Because nothing precisely, exactly happened. Yet, one has to take into consideration in the reoccurrence of love, in reoccurrence of intelligence, in reoccurrence of life, that zeroarity is now a proportional, relational actuality and needs always to be taken into computing, always being taken into the order, so that whatever one is talking about now always has a ratio ability. Instead of 1 just being 1, 1 is like 1 over 0. Or 1 is now 1 over 1. 1 over 0 begins the sequence as 0, and 1 over 1 creates then 1. So that in nature, in ritual, in myth, in symbols, you can talk about 1. But in vision, you can never talk about 1. You have to talk about 1 over 1, about that ratio. That's why consciousness is called rational. Not because it's cut and dried and doesn't dance good, doesn't wear pretty costumes. Rationality is ratio and ability. It's because consciousness now has a proportionate relationality that always needs to be tuned into. You may not have to use it every single time. There are many things that you can just get by rote, like involuntary bodily functions. They happen. They occur. But you can enter into a concentration where you can modify them to whatever you need to be. To make breathing or heartbeat or any involuntary bodily actions voluntary and change it. Because consciousness can do that. So that consciousness is a fifth dimension. And if four-dimensional space-time curves, and curves to a zeroarity, a singularity of a 0, consciousness begins at that. A five-dimensional conscious space-time just begins there. That's just for openers. So that when somebody says, oh, well, we're raising consciousness, one's eyebrows arch a little bit. Oh, are you? How are you raising consciousness? By the hands? By the mind? What? Let's get serious here. You're raising consciousness. You're raising the zeroarity of an objectivity that is infinite. Good luck. Don't insure it. You can't afford that. It's nonsense. And yet the planet is populated by carpetbagger, wisdom, so-called teachers who, by the satchel full, are spieling junk. And it just simply, none of it holds at all. At all. Ever. Never did. Never will. What do you do then? How is there any traction so that anything can occur? This was exactly the condition of modern science around 1913, almost 85 years ago. It was in that kind of a quandary. Well, if that understanding, that intuition is real, how can we make any progress then? On what basis can we count? And Wheeler, at the very end of his series of recollections, in an essay called It from Bit, has these kinds of sentences. The space-time continuum, ? Even continuum existence itself, ? Except as idealization, neither the one entity nor the other can make any claim to be a primordial category in the description of nature. That is to say, their existence is not existence as things. That's, for openers, on level that's very problematic. But even raising it several orders to existence as mind-certain objectivities, that also is highly problematic. And in fact, very wishy-washy. It is wrong, moreover, writes Wheeler, to regard this or that physical quantity as sitting, quote, out there. That book is out there. Well, in a very limited way, yes. But my ability to say yes is highly conditioned and mentally quite suspect. The logic upon which that is based is completely nonsensical. Even 3 generations before Niels Bohr in 1913 posited that somehow Einstein's theory of relativity had touched a hot wire that really didn't connect. Yes, the wire was hot, but it was disconnected at both ends. It was hot in and of itself, but not hot because it was tied to any current that one could say had existence. It was hot, Bohr said, because someone was looking at it. That the observer, in that very act of observing it to that degree of specificity, that depth, made, in fact, a very peculiar reality happen. And so there is a sense in Wheeler, in his writing, that the observer, participant, is somehow tied up with the mystery of actuality on level of consciousness. He writes here, it is wrong, moreover, to regard this or that physical quantity as sitting out there with this or that numerical value in default of question asked and answer obtained by way of appropriate observing device, namely someone. The observer is the observing device. The information thus solicited makes physics come in bits. What is a bit? A bit is the smallest level of binariness, which is what? Which is 0 and 1. It's a bit. So that the atomic level of thingness can't be put down to ones. It has to be put down to paired 0 and 1 bits. That's as far as you can go. If you go to something subscendent, if you try to get rid of the 0 or the 1, you end up with emptiness, which includes you. And that is an experimental reality. You can repeat that experiment as many times as you need to check it out, to make sure that that is in fact what, quote, happens, and then you can say that's exactly what not happens exactly each time. Yet we still live. Yes, we live and we do things, and there are things here, but there's a mystery that has to now consciously be attended to all the time, and on every level of strategy and approach, one is wise because one computes in the mystery all the time. You make room for it. And the room that you make for it is at least half of everything that you're doing. It's not like tithing that you give God 10%, but it's 50-50 partnership. No one has controlling interest. No one has controlling interest. So that part of the mystery of reality is that it's always cooperative with the unknown. Deeper, it's always cooperative with the unknowable. So that zero-arity is always an ordering strategy that holds, so that when you achieve that singleness of alignment, you're doing that courtesy of very large environment of emptiness that holds back the applicable many multi-dimensional squiggles that would happen to that line and allows it to be straight for as long as you care to draw it. And that's done because of courtesy, not because of reality, not because of actuality. So the saying goes back to something a couple hundred years ago. There are no straight lines in nature. Back to a time when the first polarity was recognized, the polarity of electricity. Back to the very first person who was the first observer who got that the polarity has an energized current that is real only as long as the polarity touches in a vibrational way, in a wholeness. And if it doesn't, there's no circuit, there's no current, there's no electricity whatsoever. Only zero-arity. And the person who did that was Benjamin Franklin. And here, right in the middle of John A. Wheeler's collected essays, published by the American Institute of Physicists, is his mystical poem to Benjamin Franklin. Because when you're conscious by the beginning of the 21st century, we mean conscious of a lot of mystery, of a lot of unknowability that goes beautifully with knowing a lot about what's real. Let's take a break. In 1967, this particular book was published, A Guide to Feynman Diagrams in the Many-Body Problem in Physics, Mathematical Physics. A second edition appeared of this book 9 years later, and there was a radical revision so that something happened between 1967 and 1976 to convince the author that he needed to modify the structure of his book. And the radical difference is that in 1976 he added a chapter 0. Because by 1976, you can see how new this is, it was apparent that chapter zeros were very important to have. In fact, the first book to have a chapter 0 was earlier that year Chapter 0, Executional Abstraction, in a programming manual by the great Dutch genius Edgar Dijkstra, a discipline of programming published by Prentice Hall Series in Automatic Computation. It's a computer monograph by one of the world's great geniuses in computing, who now, I think, holds up with a number of other geniuses at the University of Texas in Austin, which is not only the state capital of Texas, but is a money center. It's where the money is. Chapter 0, Executional Abstraction. Chapter 0 begins like mathematical texts that usually have each paragraph within a chapter having a decimal place. Like they'll have chapter 1, and the first topic in chapter 1 will be 1.1. The first topic here is 0.0. It's interesting because in the 9 years between 1967 and 1976, we got down to 0.0. And by 1985, when the consciousness text called The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai and Across the Eighth Dimension, the coordinates were, how did the movie Alien phrase it? Tracking 0, 0, 0. So we got to all three coordinates being 0, 0, 0. The three coordinates of space became 0, 0, 0 by 1985, expressible. That is to say that it's recent that the accuracy of Western thought, not just Western thought, the accuracy of a planetary consciousness, which is a resonance of the transformation of Western thought, has gone very far apace. 85 years ago, there was only one person who was able to think that far, and his name was Niels Bohr. He's a Danish physicist, and he was able to understand that in the computations of one of his genius graduate student proteges, there was a difficulty. In Pius's book, Niels Bohr's Times, it's on page 308. This takes us to the situation as it had developed between them. By March 18th, in 1927, Bohr came back from Norway, and his student Heisenberg, Werner Heisenberg, famous for the uncertainty principle, which came out of this contact, showed him a paper he had written. According to Klein, that is one of the biographers, Bohr read the paper and at first was taken with it, but when he began to look more closely, he became very disappointed because he saw that there was a serious error in the paper, not in its general conclusions, but in the way Heisenberg had treated the example of detecting the electron's position with a gamma ray microscope. If you recall, about a month ago, we talked about the electron as being the first particle that was discovered. In fact, this year, 1997, was the centenary. It was discovered in 1897 by J.J. Thomson. And yet I brought in a physics book by J.J. Thomson from 1908, and it still talked about the corpuscular theory of the electron, that the atom had something to do with corpuscles, had something to do with these kinds of units, and that the electron had something to do as a subunit of this unit. And it wasn't until J.J. Thomson's lectures in Philadelphia at the Benjamin Franklin Institute, he keeps showing up, that the electron was seen to be a particle of negative electricity that, in the language of that early time, orbited around the nucleus of the atom. And so there was an atomic structure for the first time. That is to say, the atom was not just an irreducible oneness, but the atom had a relational structure. It had the electron and the nucleus. And it was discovered that the nucleus had a composition. Eventually it was seen to have a positive charge of electricity, the proton, which was about 1,800 times the size, that is, in terms of its mass, in terms of its weight, in terms of its oomph. So that this little 1/1800th negative charge balanced with this proton. And later on, there was a discovery, much later, of a neutral particle, the neutron. All of this work was developed and fortified by mathematics. The genius in the works, the early genius in the works, was not Bohr, but Einstein. And Albert Einstein, as his work became progressively known, was from early in the First World War on compared in a problematic way with Bohr, so that there was such a thing here in 1996 as the publication Einstein, Bohr, and the Quantum Dilemma. And the positions of Einstein and Bohr are taken today by Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. The positions are not reconcilable. Einstein belongs in a tradition that goes back to Pythagoras. That tradition can be characterized by geometricity. That somehow whatever can be understood, whatever is real is understandable and therefore real in a geometric way. That space in its three coordinates, its x, y, and z axes, that space can be geometrized, and that this geometry of space is what is the very context and arbiter of what is real and thus truthful. Bohr, on the other hand, began to exercise a very specific criticism of this, that when you brought time and space together in the same computation, there was an illusion of accuracy in terms of time and space united together, that somehow the time dimension and the space dimensions did not meet exactly, and mathematics could show this. That if you were specific in the one instance, you were necessarily inspecific in the other. And thus there came to be, his student Heisenberg was the one who developed the math, so they call it the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but it's Bohr's insight. But Bohr's insight went deeper. He saw that because realistically time and space cooperate together, there must be some deeper or some higher basis upon which their cooperation happens. And he called this basis complementarity. And his initial insight trigger into complementarity was the Taoist writings of Lao Tzu. So that on this Danish physicist, he put on his family crest a Tai Chi symbol, which is there today, which his descendants now have as part of the family crest. At the very same time as he was putting the Tai Chi symbol on his family crest and beginning to absolutely shake up the world of physics, Einstein was so incensed, he uttered the famous phrase, "God does not play dice." You can't say that what is real in the universe is real on a chance basis. And Bohr said the math shows that that's what's happening. That in fact, not only does God play dice, he's a high roller. He gambles it all every single time. And that we have quite a parentage. We have remarkable courage in face of absolute nothingness to have everything go on all the time. That at every event that's real, the entire reality of what is rolled. And that it keeps coming up is due to the fantastic finesse of the dice thrower. Now, we saw in our education 2 years ago, and in 2 months we'll begin again in the very same way, that there's no way to begin a reality education. A high wisdom education cannot begin. It does not have a beginning point. And so you just simply do it anyway. This is why the father of the tradition is called the Hermetic tradition, and the father of that is Hermes. And Hermes, basically, before he was all the other things, the guide of souls, the psychopomp, and so on, the creator of language, before that, he was a cattle rustler. He was a thief. Hermes' original occupation was that of a thief. And no small-time thief. The first herd he ran off was Apollo's herd. He took all of his sacred cattle. Not to barbecue, and not to sell to the U.S. cavalry in a John Ford film, but just to have them. Not that he had them, but he got them away from Apollo. Because Apollo is the Greek god who stands for thusness, stands for that oneness, is the sun god. He's there in his oneness. There's some deep theological books from the Jungian 30s comparing Christ and Apollo. Apollo is the god of bright, certain yesness. And Hermes' first career is to take his herd away, to take his sacred cattle away, his sacrificial icons away, so he didn't have any. So that Apollo could have the opportunity hermetically to realize that he was still Apollo without needing sacrificial icons. That lo and behold, it didn't make any difference that he was still Apollo. Was shocking. Crisp, clear, well-defined Greek gods on level of Apollo didn't know that. That they were, regardless of their lack of defining characteristics. Especially the defining characteristic of sacrifice of sacred cow to you so that you could be real God. That it was unnecessary. It was unnecessary because it was not a defining actuality for the presence of Apollo. That his defining actuality was not at all what he had assumed and his worshippers had assumed. That in fact, he was real in spite of the lack of definition. So Apollo, in his newfound humility, instead of punishing Hermes, made him a partner in a larger ranch. A ranch that didn't feature cows that were sacrificed to gods, but a ranch now that was like Gene Autry's Melody Ranch, a ranch that was like a dude ranch where people could get together in terms of music and singing under the moonlight and in the sunlight, and a really different kind of a Pythagorean type of a ranch. Because Hermes said to Apollo, I stole your cattle, that's true, but to make up for it, I'm going to make you a musical instrument that's tuned. It's going to be a 9-stringed lyre that's tuned so that these 9 strings together make some kind of a chord. And each one of these strings on this archetypal lute will be a note that corresponds to a muse. So that with this lute, when you play it, the strings are tuned to the 9 muses. And so Apollo became the head, not so much the head, but the context, the wholeness of the order of the muses in their vibratory chord. That all the muses that inspire man fit together in a set, and that set's called a chord because that set is a musical set. And that chord is a tunable, proportional reality. Its proportional relationality is in terms of the chord, which is the wholeness, which is the one, and each note on that is a part of that one, is a subset of that one, and one arranging those subsets, which are notes, which are the strings, can play not only rhythm but melody. And so a musical universe was born out of this. So it's fantastic partnership. Apollo Hermes Incorporated, fantastic partnership. Musical universe came out of that. Sense that there is a music of the spheres. But the Greek mind, in its classic physics, was able to count only 7 spheres. They saw the sun, they saw the moon, and they saw 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And they saw them moving, and so they had 7 spheres, yet they had an understanding of a 9-chord music. So that there's a very peculiar kind of quality here. One had 2 distinct orders of clarity in classical Greek mystical exactness. One had a 7-string lyre, and one had a 9-string lyre. The 7-string lyre belonged to Orpheus. And that 7-string lyre was a lyre that had a mysterious quality to it. The 9-string lyre of Apollo was exact and was complete in a chord of 9, but the Orphic lyre was knowingly incomplete, that its 7-string chord played the music that could be heard, but also had two notes, had a pair of notes that was part of the music that couldn't be heard, but was complementarity, implicit in Orphic thought. And so Greek religion had two distinct modes. It had an Orphic mystical mode, and it had an Apollonian intellectually certain mode. And of course, it finally settled out, like it settles out with Einstein and Bohr, or with Hawking and Penrose. Then it was Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was very good and complete on what could be known, and Plato was very good about what could be known, but always included the unknown as a part of the sequence, a part of the sequence that definitely could not be known, and yet you had to take it into consideration. So in an Aristotelian treatise, you will find a descriptive accuracy in terms of a logical presentation, very Apollonian. But in a Platonic dialogue, you will find moments of transformation within those dialogues where the speaker will come up against a threshold where no one knows, and instead of speaking with certainty, will deliver some kind of a myth, or will deliver some kind of a poetic metaphor, or will say, at this exact point, no one knows. So that Platonic dialogues, the complementarity of at least two speakers, includes resonances of the unknown all the time. And so the wisdom is called Socratic wisdom, which means that you know what you know, but you also know that there's a lot that you don't know at the very same time. You're very clear about what you don't know. Not that you know what you don't know, but you know that you don't know it. It's like who's on first, right? Abbott and Costello. So here we have a tradition that in its Apollonianness has a oneness, it's certain, and in its hermeticness has the zero. So you have that binary that is consistently there in the Western tradition all the way up to 1998, right there all the time. And that those two traditions don't merge. The phrase that applies to them in terms of logic is that they are disjunctive. They're like parentheses turned the wrong way. The closer that they approach, the more they're never going to get any closer. So if you force them with superhuman energy, you get them ever closer and ever more certain they're never going to touch. They're disjunctive. Their reality is that they do not meet. And like if there's anything certain, it's that they don't meet. There was a famous mathematician in the 19th century, a man named John Venn, V-E-N-N. Later in the 20th century, after many generations, a whole development of finite mathematics came out of Venn diagrams, of geometric overlappingness and the characteristics of geometric overlappingness and relationality that showed that the mind is very good at knowing completely what it knows in terms of geometry, and never suspects that there's anything else. Because anything else is called nonsense or irrational. That's what is rational is what can be geometrically analoged And if you can't geometrically analog it, if you can't get an image of it, if you can't get an abstract geometrical picture of it, then it's got to be nonsense. It's got to be irrational. And what Weir said in 1913 is what Plato said in about 375 BC. We are capable of being very definite about the uncertainty of being able to image all of reality. So that the Orphic Platonic tradition has a mystery to it, and they were called in antiquity mystery religions. They were not at all related, they were disjunctive to geometric, intellectual pictures that were exact. So the geometrizers were quite certain that they knew the whole picture because they had the complete readout. We have it. Whereas the mystery school people said, yeah, we have a complete readout too. And our complete readout does everything that your readout does in 7 rather than in 9. And we know that your 9 was exactly perfect, which means if our 7 is perfect and your 9 is perfect, 2 of what you had in your perfection are unknown and yet circulating here in our perfection. That's how come we know. We believe you. I think they said that in Ghostbusters, right? We're ready to believe you. Yeah, we believe you. We know that you have it all, that you understood it accurately. And we're able to take that accuracy in 7 stages rather than 9, which means that 2 of your phases, a pair of your structure, is somewhere in the unknowable and is circulating and yet is not necessary for this more refined perfection. Later on, the 7 stages, the 7-phased perfection was called the Hymarmene. That was the way the Hermetic tradition about 100 AD phrased it. And the Gnostic tradition in the next century said, that's exactly the proof that there is a real God who is perfect and a phony creator God who creates a universe within that seems to be perfect and isn't. Because when you compare the two, you can see that there is at least minimally, a pair out of that perfect chord that are no longer there in this chord, which is also perfect in its way, and where are they? So there's a missing mystery quality, which means that this universe is obviously made by some demiurge, instead of by God, some secondary creator. And it must be flawed. Flawed how? Flawed not because it's imperfect in its illusion. The illusion is quite real, and it's perfect. It's flawed in that something mysterious is missing, and what's missing we don't know about it at all, so it's unknowable. So what makes it illusion is not something that is missing because it could be known, but exactly that unknowableness is missing. That's why it's an illusion. That's why it's deceptive. Because we lose the taste for the unknowable. We lose the taste for the mystery of God. We don't yearn for the unknowable anymore. We're satisfied with the knowable. And that's what makes it deceptive and illusory. And that's what bothered Einstein. He said it's not possible that God plays dice. The mysteriousness has got to be there in the geometric ordering. We just need to expand our consciousness. We need to be more clear And what it was before is that our geometry was static. We thought space and its lines, its lineaments, were straight, when actually when you add time as a dimension to space, all lines then curve. So that space-time is curved. And that by taking the curvature of space-time, you can then find a geometricity, a very special, wild, weird geometricity that will be perfect. And Bohr said, I hear you. I don't believe you. Because I have a whole other readout that includes a mysteriousness, an unknowability, an uncertainty, as a principle even. In order to remind them, they tried to string around the finger to the head, saying, we know that it is not known for certain that time and space together can be computed by an observer. And later on, another graduate student of Bohr's, a man named Schrödinger. They don't write too much about him because he liked the ladies a lot. A womanizing genius. But he was a genius. He saw that light, the basic phenomenon of metaphysical arbiter of what is real throughout the millennium, that light itself showed this kind of uncertainty. It was both a particle and a non-particle, a wave. That in certain experiments, light was always a particle, and yet in a whole other batch of experiments, it was always a wave. That the same phenomena, light, photons, was both a particle or a wave all the time, and that he worked out the math, Schrödinger's equations for wave mechanics. And he showed quite conclusively, this is by the end of the 1920s, that the math shows a transform that mysteriously always is capable of happening, that a photon can be a particle and at any particular nanosecond be a wave. And that the arbiter of whether it is a wave or a particle is who's running the experiment. So it was like ears up time. Eyebrows into the hairline time. What is going on here? This nice, cool Apollonian science, physics, all of a sudden is including us in whatever is going on, so that one is dealing with a conscious space-time. That space-time itself becomes, in some reciprocal way, conscious of us and includes us in the result. Each and every, all, and absolutely forever. That it's always going on and always happening. So that the attempt to try to find some way to settle this, because the urge to settle this is very Apollonian. It has to be one way or another. They too are in some kind of negative, ironic, paradoxical way gamblers. They're ready to gamble away all certainty forever to be certain that they're right. This is the nature of not only the species, but the nature of objective reality. In any conscious entities, in any star system, once they achieve an objectivity of differential form in their person, they have to be counted as one of the coordinates of what is space-time real. Until they have achieved that kind of differential objectivity of artistic personhood, they're folded into the objectivity of the mind or the objectivity of the body. And then the objectivity of the body, along with the objectivity of the mind, are all folded into the integral ecology very nicely. It's only the mind at its zero center that colors outside the lines. And because it can color outside the lines, it's called, in Vajrayana, it's called Lam Rim. It means no boundary wisdom. It means that the mind now has exceeded the coloring book that nature gave it with its creation. And that it can color outside the lines. And that those colors are real there. That instead of having Davids that color within the form outlines, one now has Matisses also that use color outside. Or Kandinskys that just use color, not objectively. They don't have any lines that define forms at all. They don't need them. You can have them if you would like them, but you can also not have them if you would like that. So that the scale of freedom asymptotically rises to infinity. That conscious, differential, spirit persons in their objectivity raise the possibilities to infinity. And so in that infinity, in that kind of wild freedom of possible actuality, one overwhelming objective reality looms irresistibly, and that is the cosmos itself. It's like Melville in Moby Dick. At the end of the first chapter of Moby Dick, he's talking about how meditation and water are wedded forever, and that anybody who gets near any kind of body of water will start to think deeper, start to go into some profound trance, and that especially you can see even in a stupid, crazy jungle like the New York City of his day, people will stand at the end of piers looking out towards the Atlantic Ocean, wrapped in reverie. Even the most stupid level of person in New York City finds this meditation and water wedded. And he said when he himself went into his deepest, profound vision of meditation and water, what he saw was this transcendental vision of pairs of rows of angels, each with their hands in large jars of spermaceti, going off into the distance, and there, in the distance, rising out of some kind of infinity, was a white snow hill in the air, which he recognized as the back of a huge whale named Moby Dick. That there is some kind of pause in the midst of ecstatic infinity, beyond which some exclamation mark suddenly appears out of nowhere, and that's the cosmos in its full objective reality. All the stars are real then, together, as some kind of entity. Not only all the stars you see, but all the stars you could ever see, in increasing powers of magnification, indefinitely, is all one linked, relational entity, conscious, which knows you and includes you in some crazy mystical way as an equal. That you are, in your realized differential spirit form person, exactly 50-50 with all of that. So along with great humility comes this great profound dignity that you count for more than you could ever have believed. Now that person deserves the best education you can give them, because it's yourself. Why trash the mind as well as the body or the spirit of such a magnificent, dignified, profound being with anything less than the cream of the cream. More next week.